Welcome, government and economic students, to Mr. King's first inaugural video lecture with you guys, something I've been doing with my juniors. So how do you like this? Mr. King is yapping at you on YouTube using a Prezi. This is really kind of interesting, isn't it? I'm sure you're shaking your head going, oh my word, what is Mr. King thinking? Who knows? I don't know what I'm thinking. But the idea here is for me to present some of the information in your textbook. We're dealing now with Chapter 5, the powers of Congress. You see a nice, beautiful picture of the Capitol there. You also saw that on the handout that you received in class. So we want to start to take a look more closely at the various powers of Congress. Some of this hopefully should be review to you all. But at any rate, let's get started. There are a couple of types of powers of Congress that we're going to look at today. Express powers, those are those that are actually enumerated. Remember, enumeration is simply put numbering things. There are 17 enumerated powers, and then there is the last power that's an implied power. So Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18 is the necessary and proper clause, sometimes also known as the elastic clause, because it gives Congress the ability to enact laws that aren't specifically spelled out in the first 17 things that Congress can do, hence the term implied powers. There's also something called inherent powers, and those are powers that are reserved to governments of all sovereign nations, such as controlling borders, making trade agreements with other nations, and other administrative and political, legislative things that nations do that we don't have to really get into at this point. So we're going to take a look at some of the express powers. So let me flip over here. Come on, flip this way, Mr. King. There we go. So we got express powers, and I think you can look at the visuals there in that circle and recognize quickly that there are a number of express powers. First, I want to go back to the idea. One of the main powers that the Constitution does enumerate for Congress is the ability to raise money and to borrow money. So Congress has the authority to levy taxes and also borrow money. That generates what we call revenue, and the revenue generated through taxes or borrowing money funds or finances the government's activities, pays for salaries, offices, missions, a whole myriad of things, defense, etc. So this was obviously something that the founders wanted to take up, and the Articles of Confederation were really weak on that point. The Confederation Congress could not, in fact, raise money. So this is Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, and this again is an express power, the power to lay and collect taxes, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States, to use the precise language. There are several types of taxes. One's an indirect tax, and that is a tax levied on one person or producer but passed on to another for payment to the government. We all pay indirect taxes on things like gasoline and airline tickets. In fact, airline ticket taxes just went up as a result of the last budget bill signed at the end of the year, 2013. There's also something called a direct tax, and that's on an individual. But Congress really was somewhat fearful of the direct tax, so they really kind of limited the direct tax in Section 9, Clause 4, saying that direct taxes had to be levied in proportion to a state's population as determined by the census. And this provision was meant to reassure slaveholding states who feared having to pay taxes on their slave population. And so at this point, really, there was no direct tax in the early part of the United States and its history. That was going to change in 1913 with the passage of the 16th Amendment. At that point in time, the United States government had grown greatly. The United States economy had grown greatly. The population had grown greatly. You get the idea. Everything in the United States was growing. Therefore, the government grew, although today some would have you believe that the government should be shrinking. That's a debate for another day. However, the politicians in Congress decided that, hey, the tariff that had been the traditional means or tax on imported goods wasn't really raising enough revenue, and it was causing trade problems. We had a very, very high tariff, and that was limiting free trade. So Congress in 1913, in the Underwood Simmons Act, that is the Underwood Simmons Act of 1913, decided that, hey, if we want to have better trade relations and have more trade with countries around the world, let's lower our tariff. But what's the problem? You guys are smart. You lower the tariff, you lower then the revenues that the U.S. government is going to collect. So what they decided to do was say, we'll lower the tariff, good for trade, we'll increase business, but we'll put into place a direct tax on incomes. So we have the birth of the much reviled income tax in 1913 with the passage of, again, the Underwood Simmons bill. That was Congress's bill authorizing lower tariffs and the tax. And then it was actually proposed to the states as an amendment to the Constitution, and the states adopted it. So the 16th Amendment of 1913 allows Congress the power to levy an income tax, something that it has continued to do and something that is the source of great, angry, contentious debates today. Lots of fun, right? That's why we love politics and economics, because they sort of go hand in hand. The other thing that I mentioned, too, that the Constitution allows Congress to do is to borrow money so that the United States can meet its obligations and cover its expenses. And this is something that was typically done only in times of emergency, typically during wartime. If you look at the Revolutionary War, if you look at the War of 1812 that everybody forgets, if you look at some of the other campaigns against Native Americans, the Civil War, the United States government often borrowed money to meet the expenses during those times of war and crisis. However, borrowing money was limited to those times of crisis. However, in the last 20 to 30 years, the United States government has relied heavily on borrowing money from other nations, in particular China, to meet expenses. All right, so we're going to move on now to look at the other area that Congress has a lot of authority over, and that's commerce. That is the idea of trade. Congress alone can pass laws affecting economic activity that takes place across state lines. So anytime there's business that involves crossing from one state to another, Congress has the ability to regulate that trade or that commerce. And we find that that in Article 1, Section 8, Clause number 3. So again, it is an express or enumerated power. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 of the Constitution. That's really known as the Commerce Clause, and that was also a weakness of the Articles of Confederation. If you remember, different states, especially around the New York Harbor, New Jersey, New York, and Connecticut in particular, were always at odds with one another over who was really going to control the trade and benefit from the trade coming in to the United States. So Congress has that authority, and Congress has exercised that authority over the years. And in fact, from 1789 to 1950, no clause in the Constitution was the subject of more litigation, and that is court cases, than the Commerce Clause. So Congress is exercising its authority to regulate trade. This led to a number of disputes. Citizens and or states who are unhappy about Congress's rulings, and therefore there were a number of Supreme Court cases. The first case that we're going to look at with regards to the Commerce Clause is the Gibbons versus Ogden case of 1824. It's known as the steamship case, and that really helped define the Commerce Clause and gave the national, or that is the federal government in Washington, ever greater powers or authority over trade. Remember, Chief Justice John Marshall, who took the court in 1803, is a very, very staunch defender of the nation and the nation's powers, that is the national government. And in this case and in other cases that we've seen, McCulloch versus Maryland, we also saw the Madison versus Marbury case, we see that Marshall is interested in promoting and extending the power of the national government. Well, the steamship case is very simple. There was a steamship operator who had a monopoly given to him by the state of New York over trade on the Hudson River. Another guy came along and said, well, I want to start operating a steamship as well. It's not fair that the state of New York granted a monopoly to this other individual. And it was taken all the way to the Supreme Court, where, in fact, Marshall struck down the state law of New York, stating that Congress has the right to regulate interstate commerce. And you must realize that steamships were passing back and forth between New York and New Jersey, also Connecticut. So this was something that defines the Gibbons versus Ogden case, and again, it gave Congress the right. And again, Supreme Court rulings lead to precedent, which means law. So that's a rather important case. Now, moving on from the Gibbons-Ogden case, we'll see other court cases later in the 1960s, the Civil Rights Act, and that was going to be tested in Hart Atlanta Motel versus the United States. The Hart Hotel of Atlanta said, look, we don't really need to open up rooms to African Americans because our business is not involved in interstate travel. We're located in Atlanta, Georgia. We deal solely in Atlanta. The Supreme Court, however, felt otherwise and ruled that because people travel from state to state and stay in motels, that the Hart Atlanta Motel was at fault and had to open its rooms to African Americans. So that was a rather important case. Defense-related powers. Obviously, the idea of Congress declaring war is an expressed power reserved just for Congress. The commander-in-chief, the president, executes those wars. However, of late, what's happened is after World War II, the last fully declared war in United States history, you have presidents taking the United States into conflict, into armed conflict, that is, into war, which seems to be a violation of the Constitution because only Congress has that authority. And so the Vietnam War is really the case study here. The United States was engaged in Vietnam, Southeast Asia, for over 9 up to 10 years in what was a war. However, it wasn't a formally declared war, and the president had received, if you will, different resolutions authorizing the use of force. In this case, it was the 1964 Gulf of Tonkin. That I got carried away here, hit a button and pause. So I'm back. We're talking about the war powers idea and how President Johnson in the 1960s had really taken the United States to war in Vietnam without a formal declaration of war. He had received what was known as the Gulf of Tonkin resolution from Congress saying, hey, something happened in the Gulf of Tonkin off the coast of Vietnam. Possibly one of 2 U.S. destroyers was attacked by North Vietnamese patrol boats. And Congress said, look, Johnson, if you want to, you can, in fact, send military troops to the region to sort of figure out what's going on there. Well, Johnson used that as a pretext to send over 500,000 men and women to Vietnam for over 10 years. After the Vietnam experience, Congress sort of passed what was known as the War Powers Resolution Act of 1973. So I'll repeat that, the War Powers Resolution Act, which stated that, yes, a president may at times need to take the nation into armed conflict, but Congress then has to approve of that, and a president typically has 60 to 90 days of combat or armed conflict before Congress has to weigh in and authorize a continuation of the conflict or a cessation of the conflict. And remember that Congress is in charge of money, and so if the president wants to take the nation into war for more than 90 days, it's going to cost money. Who provides the money? Congress. So at some point, Congress can step in and deny funding to any type of military operation begun by the president. So it gets a little tricky and complicated. What should be rather clear is that Congress has the ability to create the Army and the Navy. Congress has the ability to declare war. The president merely executes the war. But things have gotten somewhat blurry with our involvement in Korea under the auspices of the United Nations. In Persian Gulf I, we had a coalition of the willing of international nations. Iraq, we kind of went in on our own again with the tacit consent of Congress, but that is where we are. Now let's take a look at some of the other express powers, and you can see those clearly. Coinage, money. but not paper money, so that'll be an interesting thing. The Postal Service, copyrights and patents to protect intellectual property, weights and measures, very important if you're going to have a smooth functioning economy. Bankruptcy, what happens when things don't go well? Well, there's bankruptcy that Congress can also look at. Naturalization, those coming to the United States need to be integrated into the United States. There needs to be a formal path to citizenship. That's much debated today, but naturalization is another express power. Federal courts, we already have heard about, and then last but not least, congressional elections. And with that, we'll end